Fresh off the back of giving this talk to a wonderful group of people with type 1 diabetes at Shrewsbury under the care of Dr. Mulick, I thought I would record the top 10 tips for diabetes management with a specific focus of people on AID systems. So if you're going to watch this, this is not me giving you advice of what to do, but just really some information with regards to what has helped certain people. If you're going to think about trying any of these things, it's your due diligence to check with your healthcare provider as to whether that's going to be suitable. I have no skin in your game. I've got absolutely know nothing about you. I only know that these are generic principles which will work very well. So please take that on board and don't use directly. Consider this and obviously discuss with your healthcare team. Disclaimer over, let's get into it. So the first three we're going to focus on is basically food and insulin, which are applicable for everything in diabetes, but also still apply for people using automated insulin delivery systems. So the first one we'll talk about is 3 balanced meals with 10 minutes of activity afterwards. The second one is how do you deal with high fat, high protein meals on these systems with the principle of find out before you fiddle, and then thinking about 25% extra insulin increments if that doesn't work. And most importantly, how do you prevent after meal spikes, which still continue to happen on these systems, especially if insulin timing is off, and what can we do to manage those? So this is just an old school mealtime insulin guide, which basically shows you, as you can see here on all these 3 pictures, this is a high carb, low fat meal, a balanced meal, high fat meal with carbs. You can see insulin peaks at 2 hours and works over 4 hours. So if you want your glucose level to stay in target, the glucose absorption from the meal needs to match that. So you can see for your Cocoa Pops, jam on toast, that you get this rise in the glucose level afterwards because the food beats the insulin. So what you can do is put some activity in after eating to supercharge that insulin in terms of how fast it works, and then you'll get a much flatter profile. So you can tell the difference between young people who walk to school after breakfast and when they don't on the weekend. You'll notice a huge difference. So putting in that 10 minutes after walking, after eating, really makes a huge difference on the glucose levels. Obviously, what you really want to do is get your meals as balanced as possible. A carb source, a protein source, a vegetable source with a bit of fat. That way then the glucose absorption goes in at the same speed of the insulin and your glucose levels stay very, very flat and don't really rise. If you put 10 minutes of activity in afterwards, you can get a flat as a pancake line. We're going to come on to this in a second, but essentially the meals which are really high fat in protein, what you find is that often the insulin works too quickly and then the glucose has a delayed rise afterwards due to the impact mainly of a high fat meal, and then you end up really rising. Now, automated insulin delivery systems are very good in that they can put extra insulin in here. But what we are finding is that with some of the meals that are really high fat in protein, these systems just can't keep up. So I've got some tips to consider for those type of meals. So it really depends on what does your day look like at the moment. So if you're Cocoa Pops for breakfast, if you're then a high carb snack in the mid-morning, followed by waffles and beans in the afternoon, by another high carb snack, then McDonald's, this is what your profile is going to look like. If you get more balanced meals and activity in, you get a flatter profile. And again, if you get 3 balanced meals with 1 snack, that's kind of what you're looking at. So even with the AID systems that can put extra insulin in after high carb meals like this, you'll still get a rise because insulin doesn't work fast enough, and that's really why putting in the activity supercharges the existing insulin and makes it work much more effectively. When carb counting is not enough. So this is a classic study done by Carmel Smart, which I love this. This is basically they got 33 young children and people and adolescents, and they brought them into the lab and fed them on 4 different mornings, 4 different types of pancakes. One was the low fat, low protein pancake, which is just 30 grams of carbs with very little else. The next one was a low fat, high protein pancake, which added in 40 grams of protein. The next one was the low fat, high fat, low protein, where there was 35 grams of fat added. And then there was a super duper deluxe high fat, high carb protein. And there's no prizes for guessing what happened to the glucose level up to 6 hours after. If you just give the insulin for the carbs alone, your insulin's carb ratio actually gives a little bit too much insulin. If you only have one of the higher fat or the higher protein, your carb ratio works quite nicely. But if you have the super duper high carb, high fat, high protein, you are going to go much higher after. So this just basically shows carb counting is most of the story, but when you start having a lot of high fat, high protein within that meal, you are going to need extra insulin. So the question is, can the systems keep up? Here's just a bit of an idea. So I want you to have a think now and take a guess before I give you the answer. This is a study from Kirsten Bell, and they took 10 adults who either got, well, they came into the lab on 2 different days, and they got a low fat, low protein pizza, which is basically a pizza base with a bit of carbonara, with a bit of marinara sauce on, 70 grams of carbs. And the next time they brought them in, they put a high fat, high protein, all the cheese, all the meats, and got a really high fat, high protein, but they're still the same amount of carbs. So have a guess now. If we call the first meal 100% of what was required for insulin, what would the extra percentage be to cover this extra high fat, high protein on average? So was it 25% extra, 50, 75, 100? So make your guess now before I give you the answer and you'll be able to see. So on average, 65% more insulin was required, but importantly, out of those 10 people, one person only required 17% extra and one person required 124% extra. So the person who required 17% extra, these automated insulin delivery systems will cover the extra insulin for that, no problem. For the people who need 124% extra, no chance that these systems will be able to keep up. They won't be able to put the extra insulin in fast enough. And it does need delaying, so a lot more of that insulin needs going later on. Why does this happen? So it's a rather complicated diagram, but it's important to understand this. If we consider this as a high fat, high carb breakfast, a typical English breakfast, not a typical, but a high fat, high protein one, imagine the carbs here, which is glucose attached by a bond, and then fat is a glycerol backbone with 3 little fatty acids. And that becomes important because when you consume these mixed meals, you can see the glucose gets broken down and goes into the portal vein. Now, this is really important because the portal vein is the bit that is the blood supply that connects your small intestine, where you eat food. It goes through your liver first and then goes out into the bloodstream. So what you can see here is as the glucose starts to go in, it then goes out into the blood, so you get the initial rise. But what you'll notice as the time goes on and the fat starts to get digested, these fats actually go into the liver. And in the liver cells and in the muscle cells, you can see they look like little aliens. And what they stop happening is they stop the insulin, which is represented by a key, unlocking the cell very well. So when you have a meal that's really high in fat, what you'll find is 2 to 3 hours after eating, all these fats go into the liver cells and the muscle cells and they block the effect of insulin. Therefore, you need a lot more insulin to overcome this, hence needing that 65% extra on average. And usually it doesn't happen straight away, the extra insulin, but it's the 2 to 3 hours, maybe 2 to 8 hours after eating because of this effect of the high fat meal. And if you want the technical term, it goes from a triglyceride into the cell into a diglyceride, and it's that diglyceride that actually stops the insulin working. It stops the insulin receptor coming to the surface and being used effectively. So pretty simply, a high fat meal, 2 to 3 hours after eating, you're going to get insulin resistance from the high fat, which means you're going to need quite a bit of extra insulin to keep the glucose level under control. Here's just a simple idea. When you have your standard kind of breakfast, you're not going to need to do anything extra. When you have your super duper high fat, high protein breakfast, you're going to need potentially extra insulin. Similarly for your other meals. So what to do with these high fat, high protein meals? Well, the first thing for one of my good friends, Francesca Annan, fantastic dietitian at University College London, is find out before you fiddle. If you're one of those people who only needs maybe 10 to 30% of extra insulin later on, these systems will cover it absolutely no problem. However, if you're one of the people who need 50 to 125% extra, you're probably going to need to do another strategy to make sure the system or help the system out in giving extra insulin. So if you're on a T-Slim Control IQ, what you can do is, if you notice is that the Control IQ cannot keep on top of this delayed highs, I would consider adding 25% extra carbs. So for example, if you're eating 100, dial in 125, do a 50-50 split over 2 hours and then see what happens. If that's not enough, next time do a 50% increase. And if you're still high, then 75. So you can build up in 25% increments. Importantly, on those nights, be careful of starting the sleep mode at 11 o'clock because that will stop auto corrections going in, which means the system will struggle to be aggressive enough as it possibly needs to be. If you're on the 780 CAMS or Omnipod 5, you can start by giving the full amount of insulin and see what happens. If you do have a delayed rise that the system just cannot manage, then next time, about an hour to an hour and a half after eating, dial in an extra 25%. So in the first case, you would dial 100 grams and then, for example, an extra 25, 60 to 90 minutes after. If that doesn't work next time, then you go to 50% and 75%. So you get the idea. However, if you went low with the 100% up front, next time just dial in 75% of the carbs and hopefully then the system will pick up the pieces. So 25% increments is kind of how you will consider it, but first find out before you fiddle. So now we're going to move on to stopping after meal highs. It's good that we've already seen this diagram because it's important to understand the difference between a person with type 1 diabetes and a person without. So a person without type 1 diabetes, they eat their carbohydrate foods, they go down and get digested into the small intestine, they go into the portal vein, and importantly, the portal vein is where the pancreas drops in the insulin. And this is really important because insulin comes along, grabs a lot of the glucose and stores it in the liver before it gets out into the bloodstream and further around. Therefore, the glucose appearance in the blood is a lot lower than it would be than with a person with type 1 diabetes, and it's mainly because insulin gets dropped into the portal vein, which is the blood supply from the intestine, the digestive system, to the liver. So most of it is captured within here before it can get out and potentially do any damage. A person with type 1 diabetes obviously doesn't put insulin from where the pancreas does into the portal vein. They put the insulin into the fat tissue, which goes into the outer bloodstream. So as a consequence, what happens when you eat your carbohydrate foods is it goes into the portal vein through the liver with very little storage, and then the glucose is generally higher, and then the glucose is often put into the muscles and the fat tissues before going back and being eventually stored into the liver. So it's a very important reason why people with type 1 diabetes, even if they give their insulin 15 minutes before, they still get a rise compared to people with diabetes who do not. It's all because the insulin is not quite in the ideal place. The ideal place is in the portal vein. And obviously the pancreas has lots of little beta cells that push the insulin into the blood very fast, whereas when you give the insulin in your fat tissue, it's all in one big blob and takes a lot longer to be absorbed. So there is an absorption issue as well. So what can you do? The first thing is give your insulin 15 minutes before starting on average for the average person. If you're a very young person, that might not work because you're a very slow eater, for example, or maybe a very elderly person, you may just be a slow eater. But if you're a standard speed eater, you'll need to give the insulin 15 minutes before, or 20 minutes before, as even this study, because you can see when the insulin was given 20 minutes before, there was very little post-meal rise compared to at or after eating. So this is really important. The second part is, where is the fastest place for absorption for your insulin? Well, the answer is in your belly. In your abdomen is the fastest place for insulin absorption because it has a better chance of getting also into the portal vein from there. Not far behind is the arm. So the abdomen and arm are very effective insulin absorption places, whereas the thigh and the buttocks are a lot slower. So if you're suffering from some days your post-meal glucose levels are okay, and then the next time you change your cannula, it's not. It may be because you're moving from your belly to your bum. So if you move to your bum and your thighs, the insulin absorption is slower. So in an ideal world, insulin 15 to 20 minutes before, in the arm or in the abdomen, and stay away from lumpy areas. So this is insulin given into lumpy areas, the open circles, the insulin doesn't work as well. Given into the fresh sites, it works well. So just be careful for those bumpy areas. Often forgot the basics. Insulin 15-20 minutes before, get it in the arm or the abdomen for the best effect. If you want to get really fancy, you can do something that we published on, which is called SET, which is essentially start the insulin before eating, but based on your starting glucose level and with a trend arrow. So if you're already between 10 and 14 before eating, and you've got a steady arrow across, you could actually give your insulin 30 minutes before, so it'll leave time to start to come down before it goes up again. On the flip side, if you're already heading low, you might want to prevent the hypo first before giving the insulin. And similarly, again, if you're between 6 and 10 and you're dropping fast, maybe you don't want to wait at all or wait a smaller amount of time. So if you understand glucose values and trend arrows, you can use those to change your insulin timing. But obviously, 15 minutes is the basic rule. Don't spend your life on insulin timing. Just get it in before eating to give it a head start. So that's the food and the insulin part covered. The next part is going through my favorite bit, which is activity and exercise. And the first two bits are all about activity, about movement, 3 every 30 and 10 by 2, which I'll explain shortly. That's all about movement, nothing about hypos or exercise, just general human beings movement. And then the second two are 50-50-20 and T25-T25 are starting suggested plans for people who are on pump therapy or injections, and then the difference between automated insulin delivery systems. So first part is all about activity, movement, improving time and range. The second part is about hypoglycemia risk reduction. So this is kind of what we're meant to be doing in terms of movement. So an adult ideally should be doing 30 minutes of moderate intensity activity a day, a fast walk, something like that, and then twice a week some kind of strengthening of the muscles in the body. Children and people should be doing double the amount of daily activity, 60 minutes, and then again 2 times a week, at least 2 to 3 times, something strengthening your body. So you ask yourself the question, where am I? If you're currently on 10 minutes a day and no sessions of strengthening, don't try and go to 30 and 2, try and increase it to 15 and 20, and then sort of maybe 1 session a week. So Build up slowly, otherwise your muscles will hurt and you won't like it and you'll think it's a waste of time. But I can promise you, if you build up slowly, make a massive difference to your overall diabetes control and potentially reduce your insulin requirements. So 3 every 30, what does this mean? So Matthew Campbell's team from Sunderland, they did a study called Sit Less, where they brought in a lot of adults with type 1 diabetes, and what they did is they got them to have their normal meals on a usual day, brought them into the lab twice. One day they just sat down all day, did a little bit like I'm doing now. On the next day, just every 30 minutes, they got up to walk around at normal pace for 3 minutes, just moving the body, getting the blood flowing around the body. And what they found was a percentage time improvement on the days of getting and moving compared to sitting. What percentage improvement in time in range do you think that they would have got? 14%. So it could have gone from 60 to 74%, 50 to 64, 30 to 44. So wherever you are, a 14% improvement in time in range out just getting up every 3 minutes, well, every 30 minutes for 3 minutes is a low bar to achieve to actually get some benefits in terms of glucose levels. So this will be a good opportunity now. We've been going for maybe 20 minutes or so. So now will be a good opportunity to pause, go for a 3-minute walk and get your starting of your 14% improvement in time in range. Okay, now we've got that, what other things can we do? And this is really important to understand that people with type 1 diabetes currently have the beauty of a continuous glucose monitor. So they can see what happens to their glucose levels after eating. So it's a positive feedback about when you do more activity, you see improved time in range. But the interesting thing is, if you don't have type 1 diabetes, you get the same benefit, you just don't see it. So this is back to 2012, a fantastic study where they brought 12 adults with type 1 diabetes and 12 people without, and they got them on the first day again just to sit, eat, do nothing different, and then on the second day, every 30 minutes every hour, they got them to walk around, just normal, like a nurse working on a shift, or you just moving around in general, basically not sat down on your backside. And what you can see for the people without diabetes is the days where they just sat down, their glucose levels increased by up to 5 after eating, compared to, 2.5? So a half reduction in after meal eating. They don't see that because they don't have it on a continuous glucose monitor, but I can promise you it's happening to them. For the people with diabetes, it's pretty much the same. You get a benefit, and most importantly, you don't end up going low. So this is to say, if at the moment you're not doing much activity after eating, it's not just a person with type 1 diabetes thing, it's an everybody thing. This values everybody. Moving after eating basically gets the insulin that's been delivered, either from a pump or an injection or your own pancreas. It gets it to work much more effectively, so you need less, and also so your glucose levels stay in target, looking after your health. So this comes to the simple guide again. After you've eaten, you're just going to move your backside. It could be washing the dishes. It could be going for a short walk, taking the dog for a walk. It can be just playing with your kids. It can be just moving around for 10 to 15 minutes will make a huge difference on supercharging the insulin that you've given at that meal time. Okay, now this is something I'm really interested in and been involved in quite a bit of the research around. Well, we know activity after eating stops the glucose level going high. But what about if you are high? If you're already high, above 10, what's the best way to bring the glucose level down? So traditionally, you would give a correction dose, or these automated insulin delivery systems are delivering extra insulin when you certainly go above 10, corrections aiming to bring it down. But you know that when you give insulin, it takes 2 hours to peak and 4 hours to finish, which means that you stay high for quite a long time. Which means that what happens is you look at your high level and you go, wow, I was 11 and I've given it 2 units, but nothing's happened. I've gone up to 12, so I'll give another 2 units. And it goes to 13, I'll give another 2 units. And all of a sudden you've done your rage bolusing, and in 2 hours time, 3 hours time, your glucose is dropping like a stone, you're over-treating the hypo, and you're on the roller coaster again. I want to suggest to you that there is another way to actually supercharge the insulin that you've already got working, and most importantly, get the glucose level down in 15 to 30 minutes. So this is a study which showed people who had given go walking in the 2 to 4 hours after giving insulin for a meal. You can see there's a nice steady drop in the glucose every 15 minutes. So what I teach where we work at the Children's Hospital is 10 minutes will drop the glucose level by 2. Or if you was in milligrams per deciliter, you could call it maybe 10 minutes will drop the glucose level by 30 milligrams per deciliter. And what we teach is this, is have a think about what percentage time in range you would like. And then according to the percentage time in range, let's say you wanted 70%, you'd probably have to set the high alert at 12, which means that when the high alert goes off, you need to do something, which is either allow the system to give extra insulin, give a correction, or move your backside and get the insulin that you've already given working more effectively to bring it back down into target. It can be anything that you like to do, and I'm involved in some work that shows it doesn't really matter whether it's walking, even if it's lifting weights, even if it's sports, whatever. Anything that so you get the body moving and the blood pumping and the insulin going round to the muscles works effectively. So do something that you enjoy. And this is how much you would need. So the simple bit is 10 minutes will drop you by 2 millimoles per litre, or 10 will drop you by 30 milligrams per decilitre. If you want to get fancy, you can look at the starting glucose level, where the trend arrow is going and how many minutes you would need. But it's just easier to do the subtraction. So if I'm 14, I want to get down to 10, that costs me 20 minutes of activity. If my glucose level was 250 and I wanted to drop it by 70, that's going to cost me again about 25-30 minutes of activity. So pretty simply, you're going to supercharge the insulin. And how does that work? When you're active, it opens a side door to your cell that doesn't require insulin, so more glucose allows to flow out. But more importantly is when you sit on your backside, the blood is pumped very slowly to your muscles, which means that the insulin works very slowly and the glucose stays in your bloodstream. When you actually start moving the body and pumping the blood around the body, you're pumping the insulin with it to the muscles. It means that the insulin attaches to the cells faster and the glucose goes out faster. So you effectively, exercise or activity is like spinach is to Popeye. It makes it work stronger and last longer. So at this point, we're going to break and say everything I've just talked about, being active after eating for 10 minutes, using 10 minutes to drop your glucose level by 2 millimoles per litre or 30 milligrams per decilitre is all about improving your time in range, getting general levels of activity. And not only is it good for you, it's good for everyone in the family. This next part is going to talk about actual exercise, something that's kind of 30 minutes or more of a higher intensity that's probably going to lead to hypoglycemia. So what do we need to be worried about? On a study of over 5,000 exercise events, these are the key things that predicted hypoglycemia. Not surprisingly, the first is, what is your glucose level at the start? If your level's down at 5 or 6, or in milligrams per decilitre, what's that, about 100, 120, you are going to be at a much higher risk than if your glucose level was starting above 10 or 180. The next one, as you won't be surprised to know, is your trend arrow. Where is the glucose level going? Is it dropping down? You're higher risk. Is it going up? Lower risk. The next one, and equally importantly, which we'll get to, is how much insulin on board have you got? Have you given insulin within the last 2 to 4 hours? If so, there's a much higher risk of you dropping than if you haven't had it in the last 2 hours. And then eventually this type of exercise. So is it aerobic, anaerobic, mixed? Really, that's not as important as how much insulin you got on board, what's the glucose level value and trend arrow. So that's what we're going to focus our time on, the most important things. Important to say that when you're using a continuous glucose monitor and you're dropping fast, the blood glucose level will always drop faster than the continuous glucose monitor because there is a lag time of at least 5 minutes at rest, and that goes to about 10 minutes during exercise. So if you're heading low and dropping fast, you might want to consider doing a finger prick because you could already be low, certainly if you're less than 5 or 100 milligrams per decilitre. Here's just some simple tips from the XTOD group, which basically says if you're an adult, look at your sort of starting glucose level, how many grams of carbs roughly you will need for half an hour's worth of exercise, and then essentially have a look over here. Depending on the trend arrow, you would either keep it the same if it was steady, you might need to double it if you were going low, or you might need none if you're going high. So if you was going to give 15 grams of carbs, but then you looked at your glucose level and it was say 6 with a double arrow going down, that 15 becomes 30. However, if it's a double arrow going up, you wouldn't give anything. So use the trend arrows to help you adjust the carbohydrate amounts you take during the activity. And if you're going to do this every 30 minutes, you're better off with carb sources that get absorbed quickly, like glucose drinks, glucose tablets, something sugary. For example, here, as we said, if you're going to test every 20 to 30 minutes, you want the kind of glucose-based drinks or sugar-based drinks. If you're only going to test every hour, then maybe you want something a bit more slowly acting, like a banana or a breakfast bar, something like that. Massively important question that you should always ask yourself before the type of activity I'm doing is, have you given insulin for food within the last 2 hours? If you have, you really want to be thinking about reducing the amount of insulin that you're giving at the meal at 2 hours before. Because I've already described to you that when you do activity, it pumps the blood around to the muscles faster and gets the insulin working very, very fast and more effectively. Therefore, if you're doing that with a full lot of insulin on board from the previous meal, you're at high risk of going low. So if you're going to do it within 2 hours, we need to be thinking about reducing the insulin at the meal before. In an ideal world, the aspirational rule, if you're someone who wants steady and easy to manage glucose levels during exercise, is make sure your last meal of insulin was at least 3 hours before. Therefore, the amount of circulating insulin for that meal has virtually gone out of the system, and therefore you will be less likely to fall prey to the increased insulin effectiveness because of exercise. So try and keep to the 3-hour rule if you can. If you can't and you're going to do it within 2 hours, we need to be thinking about reducing the insulin dose at the meal before. Then type of exercise, as we said here, endurance, one-paced exercise, you're expecting a drop. Very explosive exercise like powerlifting, you'll go up. Mixed exercise, you might go up or might go down depending on the intensity, and then resistance exercise the same. Now this is to say this is all based on if you have very little insulin on board. If you've had insulin, the last time you had insulin for a meal was more than 3 hours ago. If you do the exercise within kind of 3 hours, certainly within 2 hours, then basically the drops are going to be drastic. For endurance exercise, explosive might not even go up. Mixed exercise, you're likely to drop, and resistance exercise, you're likely to drop. So when you've got insulin on board, certainly in the last 2 hours from a meal, the likelihood is you're going to drop, and you're going to drop fast. So again, the importance of asking yourself that question. Have I eaten and given insulin within the last 2 hours, or even a big correction dose within the 2 hours? If you have, your risk of hypoglycemia will be much, much higher. What happens after exercise? So in this graph here, you've got the exercise event here, and this is how much glucose was required when the insulin was kept stable. So basically, this is how much glucose was required to keep the glucose level stable under steady insulin levels, which basically means as the amount of glucose goes up, the body is very sensitive to insulin. So unsurprisingly, straight after exercise, you're very sensitive to insulin, and we have to think about insulin reductions at the meal afterwards. But anyone with type 1 diabetes who've done a lot of exercise will know this very well. You go to bed, things are fine, and then all of a sudden there's a lot of insulin sensitivity between 1 and 3 o'clock in the morning. You wake up with a hypo and sweating, and you're not loving life. So we need to do something if you're on injections or pumps to manage this. But the beauty of the automated insulin delivery systems is they sort that out. They see the glucose level dropping, so they just stop or suspend the insulin. So you really get rid of the lows overnight. That's where these systems are at their premium. Okay, if you're on injections or you're on a pump that's not an automated insulin delivery system, what can you do? Well, there are kind of 320 options. If you want to prevent overnight hypos and you're on just a standard insulin pump or injections, if you're doing exercise for kind of 45 minutes or more after 4 p.m. and your glucose level is below 7 before bed, what you're probably going to need to do is reduce your background insulin by 20%, or give 20 grams of carbs with no fast-acting insulin, or give 20 grams of protein with no insulin or fast-acting insulin. Not all three, just one of these. That will obviously reduce the insulin. That will provide extra glucose, so it'll just be mopped up by the insulin that's around. And the 20 grams of protein, the amino acids from there will actually go to your pancreas and push out a little bit of glucagon to prevent you from going low. So any one of those options is useful if you're not on an automated insulin delivery system. This is a simple way to think about it for pumps and injections. It's the 50-50-20, which is basically at the meal before, if it's within 2 hours, you do a 50% of insulin reduction. After, you do a 50% insulin reduction, and then the 20 rule, which we just discussed. So in this case, Greg was going running at 12 for 1 hour on a 1:10 ratio. His breakfast is 60 grams of carbs, which is usually 6 units of insulin, 50% reduction, take half off, so you only give 3. Afterwards, 50% reduction, 5 units. You don't do anything to prevent overnight hypos because it's not after 4 p.m. Then you see what happens. That kind of worked okay, but the insulin reduction before led to him going very, very high, but afterwards was kind of fine. So next time you wouldn't do a 50% reduction at the meal before, you would do a 25% reduction. So that'll just give you some ideas of the 50-50-20 and how to adapt that as you see fit. It will require some trial and error, because as we know from a wonderful paper from Mike Riddell, is that what we teach and what we expect to happen, i.e. the 50-50-20 rule, is kind of like the median, but everyone's experience could be on the extremes. People may go up, people may go down with that based on all sorts of things, depending on how long you've had diabetes. Did you get a good night's sleep the night before? Is it a competition? your fitness level does it change in. So don't expect it to work perfectly, but the idea of having a tool such as the 50-50-20 is it's somewhere safe to start, and then you can start adapting by 25% as you see according to your continuous glucose monitor. Okay, moving on to AID systems. So those are plans kind of for pumps and injections without automated insulin delivery system. But if you're on an automated insulin delivery system, what you're going to have is either a temp target, exercise target, ease off, or activity mode. And all of these work very similarly in that they take wherever your current system is targeting to get you at and pushes it up. So usually from somewhere about 6 up to about 8, which means that the system starts suspending earlier the insulin and it doesn't give extra insulin as quick once it's starting to rise. So you ideally want to get this on an hour to 2 hours before starting. Reality check, does anyone who used to do temporary basal rates now before? Hell no. But if you can, do. But if you forget, get it on at least before, because what it will do is prevent excessive insulin going in during the exercise. So ideally an hour or two before. If you forget, get it on just before. That will just have to do. Do you still need to reduce the insulin if you're putting this activity mode on 1 to 2 hours before? Well, the answer is yes. This rather complicated slide, but it's an important slide, tells you that you definitely do. So this was activity done after breakfast, 90 minutes after breakfast. And you can see here in red, they did just the usual. They didn't put the activity target on, they gave the full insulin, as you would expect a post-meal rise, but by sort of 20 minutes in the exercise, a lot of people were experiencing lows. If they put the activity mode on, which is here in the grey, you can see it's not distinguishable between the other one, which means that essentially doing the activity mode, putting the activity mode on in the presence of a full insulin dose in the previous 2 hours, you're still going to go low. When you reduce the insulin dose by 33% as well as putting the activity mode on, yes, you did go a bit higher, but you avoided hypoglycemia. So the simple thing for this is, if you're doing exercise within 2 hours, you are going to need about a 25% reduction of the insulin as well as the activity mode to reduce the risk of going low. Not 50% like on injections and pumps, but 25%. And this is our simple for automated insulin delivery systems T25, T25. So the first T25 speaks to the first 2 hours before the exercise, which is get the activity mode on, and if you're eating, reduce the insulin by 25% by either reducing the carbs by 25% or adjusting the insulin dose it's suggesting by 25%, whatever works for you. Then just before and every 30 minutes during exercise, you will need, if your glucose level is less than 7, between 3 to 20 grams of carbs, depending on the glucose value and trend arrow. And then as soon as you finish, get the target off and maybe think about 25% reduction of the usual meal insulin. So that's your starting point. Now, if you try this and you still go low or less than 5 during this plan, then next time you'll do a 50% reduction and maybe leave the activity mode on for after. However, if you go high with this starting plan, maybe you won't put the activity mode on and maybe you'll give your usual insulin. So again, you've got an adaptation protocol, but if you remember T25, T25, target on, 25% reduction, target off, 25% reduction, you've got a good starting plan to go at. This is just someone who's on Omnipod 5 who've kind of followed this plan where they kind of did the reductions before, put the activity mode on, and the most important thing is, even though you've done this activity and exercise, the systems can modulate the insulin overnight so that you don't go low. So the absolute beauty of these systems when you're doing exercises, they take care of overnight hypoglycemia the vast majority of the time. Good night's sleep for everyone. Wake up feeling great. Very important here is that if you put the activity mode on 90 minutes before and you're doing 90 minutes of exercise, what can happen, just like here, is that it shuts the insulin off completely, and here shuts the insulin off completely for up to 3 hours sometimes, which will mean when you finish the exercise, your body will be deficient of insulin, and there is a risk of this happening, which is you eat and you give maybe your usual 50% reductions or insulin reductions, and whoop, you go flying here, whoop, you go flying high there. So the easiest way to think about this is if you're going to be suspended for a long period of time, you might turn the activity mode off halfway during the exercise. You might want to give a little bit of correction as soon as you finish to make sure you get some insulin into the system so you don't end up completely insulin deficient. So this is a new problem that's happening with these systems. Some way to overcome it though, so I'll just give you some tips. What I would really recommend, and this is a really easy read of a paper, you can get your phone out and scan this QR code. This is the practical aspects. You can download it for free. It's really easy to read. Desi, who has written it, is an absolute legend. And you will be able to look at the system you're on and get all the best tips and tricks. Basically, everything that I've just walked through, I've stolen from there. So I'm sure Desi won't mind. It's just trying to get this information out, but that paper is a fantastic paper for you to check out. Some things to consider that are system specific. If you're on a control IQ, you might want to use a different exercise profile where you can reduce the basal rate, correction factors and carb ratios by 25 to 50% and have a separate profile for that. And importantly, if you want to stop auto corrections during exercise, you can give a small little manual bolus before you start of 0.05, and that will stop the auto correction for an hour, which can be helpful. If you're on obviously these systems and you're going to have prolonged suspensions for more than 120 minutes, then obviously what you could do is give some insulin for the missed basal or turn the activity mode off halfway through the exercise, as previously discussed. I want to give you a second here to spot the difference. So have a look at these three downloads and you can see the glucose level across the top, you can see the carb entries and you can see insulin doses here, and then you can see obviously these two little spurts here and then where exercise mode has been put on. And then obviously on here, what you should be able to notice is this person's got to manual mode but has fantastic control. So this is to say, if you're someone who has fantastic plans with exercise management and on a previous pump and injections you knew exactly what was going on, your glucose levels were perfect because you understood the insulin conditions and they remained stable because your basal rate stayed the same or your background insulin doses remain the same. That will not happen when you're on an automated insulin delivery system. These systems are modulating the insulin every 5 to 12 minutes in accordance to where the glucose level is. So for example, here, when you put the activity mode on, it will be really reducing the insulin, so your usual plan doesn't work and you go high. And even similarly here, you may have had a lack of insulin around for whatever reason and going high. So it can be very frustrating if you're a person who has got excellent management around exercise to go onto one of these systems because all of a sudden your usual plans are inconsistent and don't work. There is nothing wrong with going back into open loop mode prior to the exercise and keeping the open loop mode on during the exercise. This in this case was a long day's worth of activity and doing your usual plan, but then flicking the activity mode back on to get the benefit overnight. So if you're going to do that, you would want to consider, first of all, the reason why you won't get consistent results is because the AID systems are continually changing insulin conditions, which in principle is great most of the time, but can cause a real problem if you're expecting a certain amount of insulin to be around during exercise. So if you're going to do that, you would go into open loop mode 90 to 120 minutes before you start. Make sure you have your manual basal rate set correctly according to what you need. Try and have your last meal and insulin, as we've said, 3 hours before, and you will require a bit of trial and error. But we have quite a few people who use this and use this effectively and find that they get more consistent results with their exercise management, but then get the value of the automated insulin delivery system after, because they have, they're going to be asleep and they need something to manage it for themselves. Okay, we're on to our second 3-minute break. So in conjunction with moving your ARSE gets you a better time in range, you now need to pause, go for a walk for 3 minutes, beak, not break, that's nice, for 3 minutes, and that will basically help you get your extra 14% in range. I trust that you've done that. So now we're going to move on to the final few things, which is CGM management, site management, and alcohol. So what does slow ARSE mean? Basically, it's just a little acronym to try and help you think about getting the most accurate readings and looking after your skin. So with your CGM, first of all, don't put it on a bendy area because you'll disrupt the filament. Don't put it on scarred or lipotripe or fatty tissue areas because you won't get the great read as such. The Panther program has an excellent thing for skin solutions, but the best thing to do is when you're taking things off, use some either adhesive remover or oil and take it off slow and low. So you nibble off from round the outside. You don't rip off like a plaster and disturb the skin. You put oil or remover on and nibble away slowly so you look after your skin. You're going to be rolling with 2 different devices now for a long period of time. That's a lot of skin that's going to get disrupted if you keep ripping it off like a plaster. And that'll make you more susceptible to getting infections, developing allergies, etc. So slow and low is the key. And then on the insertion, if you want to get really accurate readings, not go into muscle, what you need to do, ideally put it on your arm because that's the most accurate. Relax your body, don't tense up. A soft application, so when you're putting it on, don't press it on as hard as you possibly can. You just put it on gently, and then a sort of a lift up to get the skin away from the muscle, and then insert. So you want to do it as loosely as you possibly can. The problems why you'll hit muscle is because you're really keen to get it on. You'll press hard, you'll press the button down, and whack, it goes into the muscle, it hurts, and then it also leads to an inflammatory response, and you will not get as accurate readings. I promise you, if you relax your arm, make sure it's applied softly and elevate the skin off the muscle, you will get a lot more effective first day wear, certainly, and you'll not get frustrated by discrepancies as much. Okay, calibrations. Obviously, if you're going to do a calibration on a system that allows it, you want to make sure you've got 2 finger pricks that are good quality samples. And then if you're really sure that it's more than sort of 20% out, then calibrate at that point and try to do it when you either got a stable or slowly moving arrow. Tape down securely. If you have problems, the more tape you put on, the more disruption you put for the skin. So if you're managing without tape, I'd say don't wear it. But if you're struggling with keeping it down, tape it down securely, obviously. And if you're having real problems with sensor accuracy on the first day, I would just insert the sensor a day before, give it a chance to settle down and that local inflammatory response to disappear. And therefore, when you then start the sensor, when the next one runs out, you will have more accurate readings from the beginning. Okay, site management, think of CAR, which is change regularly every 2 to 3 days, don't leave it in forever. Abdomen is the most effective place, as we discussed earlier, and then rotate. So it's pretty simple. Obviously, don't put it on sort of scarred and bendy areas again. Abdomen is the fastest, next by the arm, so ideally keep your CGM to your arm and your insulin to your belly. Change every 2 to 3 days, and then obviously look after your skin as you go along and rotate where you do the sites, depending on there, whether you use a sort of circle system or a numbered system. Okay, getting towards the end now, sort of alcohol. So one important thing is we know that the liver in general is supplying the bloodstream with glucose 24 hours a day. That's why you need basal insulin to look after the glucose that's produced. When you drink alcohol, the body treats it like a poison. It might make you feel good, it might not. But what you will find is that when the body is dealing with that poison, it stops putting glucose into the bloodstream. So when you did have that steady supply of glucose that you give that basal insulin for, you would no longer need that basal insulin for a period of time, or certainly a lot less, because the glucose is not being outputted from the liver. So very simply, the more alcohol you drink, the less glucose that's produced into your liver. Therefore, you need to be careful with the amount of insulin around because the risk is to go low in principle. But it does depend on how much you drink. So the easiest way to think of this is alcohol in terms of units. And a simple heuristic is 1 unit of alcohol, the body takes an hour to get rid of it. So if you drink a pint of lager, the liver is going to be busy for the next 3 hours processing that alcohol to get out of the system. Therefore, for 3 hours, it's not going to be producing as much glucose. If you have a bottle of wine, that's 10 units, that's 10 hours. If you have 2 bottles of wine, that's 20 units, that's 20 hours. So you can see as your alcohol consumption increases, your risk of hypoglycemia increases because the amount of time your liver is reducing its glucose output is for a lot longer. And then importantly is your strategy will depend on how many carbs are in your alcoholic drinks. If you're drinking drinks with a lot of carbs in, say beer, lager, ales and stouts that can be anywhere between 10 and 20 grams of carbs per drink, you are going to go high at the start. So if you drink 4 pints of Guinness, that's 80 grams of carbs. You are going to go high before you come down. However, if you're drinking wine which has no carbs in, you are only going to risk of going low. So you have to think of how many carbs you're actually drinking in your alcoholic containing beverages. So there's 2 ways to look at this. One is that from a safety perspective, if you drink drinks with carbs in and push yourself high, you might be less risk of going low. On the other way around, if you want more in target control, you would drink drinks with virtually no carbs in and just mitigate the fact of going low. None is better than the other. You just need to have a strategy and be able to manage it. So have a think about now how many grams of carbs in 6 cans of cider and how many units of alcohol, wine, vodka, Alka-Pops. So pause it here and make your guesses. So 6 cans of cider is 15 units of alcohol. That's 15 hours that the liver is not producing much glucose, but you're putting 120 grams of carbs in. So that may protect you, but maybe not so much an automated insulin delivery system because extra insulin will actually be put in for these. 1 bottle of wine, 10 hours, virtually no carbs. Bottle of vodka with diet mixers, 30 hours for 30 units, no carbs. And 4 Alka-Pops, 7 hours with 60 grams carbs. So you would need a very different strategy depending on how many carbs you're drinking and how many units of alcohol that you gain. This is a I guess just a typical example of what happens. So here we go. Going out, no activity mode put on, importantly here. So no activity mode's put on, which means if the glucose level goes high, what's the system going to do? Start pumping in loads of extra insulin. So you've got 1-sider, 2-sider, 3-sider, 4-sider, 5-sider, 6-siders, about 100 grams of carbs, 15 units of alcohol. So you stay high initially, the system's pumping loads of extra insulin, and then bang, despite being completely stopped of insulin, it's too late because there is still too much insulin from back here and you end up going low. And if this young person didn't have their mum or dad coming checking them out, and that could have been very nasty. So what do you do the next night? You don't heed any further advice, you go out and have another 5 cans. And you can see again, you go high, the system pumps loads of extra insulin, and then bang, you have lows kind of all night. So we have to be very careful with these systems, because when you're on injections or pumps before, if you went high like this, you would just stay high. If you go high like this, these systems will put extra insulin in, so we need to do some extra planning for alcohol management. So how can you think about managing alcohol on these systems? Well, the first thing is how many units of alcohol you're drinking. If it's less than 4, you possibly are not going to need to do very much. If it's more than 4 units of alcohol, the liver is going to be out of action in terms of the usual glucose production for a length of time, depending on how much you're drinking. So it makes sense to, first of all, put the exercise or activity mode on before you go out until the next day, just to be on the safe side. Better to run higher than trying to get too close to target and run the risk of hypoglycemia. So if on the Cambridge system, put on the ease off, that will increase the target by roughly 2 to 3 millimoles per litre and will relax the algorithm by 30%. If you're on a T-Slim, you probably want to put the activity mode on as well as an alcohol profile, which has 50% reductions in basal rate and correction factors and carb ratios. If you're on Omnipod 5, get your activity mode on and that will relax the algorithm roughly by 50%. 780G, put the temp target on. This stops the auto corrections. However, it doesn't relax how aggressive the algorithm is. So what you might need to be a bit careful of, if you do drink drinks with carbs and you go high, it may still be too aggressive and you might need to think about going back to manual mode for the evening with a 50% temp basal rate, for example. So here are the general principles. Aim to be between 7 and 10. If you're dropping below 7, then have 10 to 15 grams of fast-acting carbs to bring you up. That could be if you're drinking spirits with diet mixers, chuck the occasional full sugar one in when you drop below 7. If you're going to be having drinks with carbs in, think about entering about half of the carbs in the alcoholic containing drinks. So if you're having a can of Guinness, which is 20 grams, dial in 10. You're having a can of cider, which is 15, dial in 7. That will stop you going too high in the first place, not going too high above 10. Obviously have a sensible person following your glucose readings and make sure you have some fast-acting glucose on you and by the side of your bed. And obviously you've got some followers that will really help and make sense. This will take practice and time and trial and error. So the simple principle is start low and go slow. Don't go out and drink 20 units of alcohol and expect everything to be okay. Number 1, you'll be sick. Number 2, your glucose control could be very, very risky in terms of going low. So if you're going to experiment, then obviously experiment, go slow, and build up with your plans as you go. They're just some starting suggestions. Really importantly is the chances of glucagon working when you've had a lot of alcohol will be very low. The job of glucagon is, as an injection, the hormone goes to the liver and liberates and releases all the glucose that's stored within the liver to bring your sugar level up. If you've been drinking alcohol all night and the liver has been busy processing the alcohol, it's not going to be able to release the glucose that's in your liver. So if you do have a low and you look like you're going severely low, you might need to get to hospital to get IV glucose to get it up. Obviously, give the glucagon to see if it works, but don't sit there expecting it to work and you to come up, your glucose level to come up. You need to get on to the hospital ASAP. You still want to give the glucagon, however, don't expect it to work and get on the phone because you might need some IV glucose to get the glucose level high. You don't want to be in hypoglycemia for prolonged periods of time. Really increases the risk of severe hypoglycemic events. So here we have it, the rapid fire summary of the top 10 tips. Number 1, food and insulin, 3 balanced meals, 10 minutes activity after. Number 2, high fat, high protein meals, find out before you fiddle, then 25% increments. Number 3, after meal spikes. Give your insulin 15 minutes before eating into the arm or into the abdomen, and obviously use activities to make sure that the insulin's working effectively. From an activity standpoint, 3 minutes of movements every 30 will get you an extra 14% in range. If you go high, if you're above 10 millimoles per litre or 180 milligrams per decilitre, 10 minutes of activity will drop the glucose level by 2 millimoles per litre or about 30 milligrams per decilitre. If you're on a standard pump or injections, think of the 50-50-20. 50% insulin reductions before and after, and 20% reductions of insulin overnight, or 20 grams carbs or 20 grams protein. T25 is for AID users. Get the target on 60 to 120 minutes before exercise, 25% reduction in the carbs entered, and after you've finished, target off, 25% reduction in the carbs entered, and the system should see you sweet overnight. For CGM, slow and low, relax your arm, put it on softly and elevate to make sure we don't cause trauma on the insertion. And for your site management, change every 2 to 3 days. Abdomen is the most effective place for the insulin, and rotate the injection sites. And then finally for alcohol, you really need the activity mode on. Aim for 7 to 10, and obviously have friends follow you who kind of can support you, and remember that the glucagon won't necessarily work. So hopefully that helps you. Any further questions, any bit of this information can be found on the glucoseneverlies.com. So hopefully that's been helpful on the top 10 tips.